All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. If you could make your way to some seats. All right, well, welcome to the Stand Firm Apologetics Conference 2018. I feel like you should clap or something. I don't know. Okay. And welcome to Southwestern Seminary. I don't know. I'm sure there's a bunch of students here, and I know there's some that are, kind of repeat attenders. And then I'm guessing there's a few that are brand new. So I just want to welcome all of you, especially those that are attending for the first time to campus. Welcome to you. So our approach here at Southwestern to apologetics is that we see this. So in apologetics, you're going to be asking the deep and difficult questions about the faith. And the way we see this is fundamentally that we are pursuing God in asking the deep and difficult questions. So what I hope you're ready for, that you've come for, is to be challenged to think more carefully, to think in some ways more critically about your faith. And I think you're going to get a lot of challenges, but we certainly hope that you come away with a lot of answers too. But sometimes you end up with more questions than answers, and that's perfectly okay, because what we're doing is we're pursuing the living God. Amen? Right? And if I don't know if you have questions about Scripture, but even as a seminary professor, I'm still asking questions about Scripture. So my name's Travis Dickinson. I get the privilege of teaching philosophy and apologetics here at Southwestern. We have a thriving department, philosophy department. There's 4 faculty members. You'll get to hear from all of them this weekend, doing the breakout sessions and that sort of a thing. And there's a lot of other guests that are joining us that we're very privileged to have them as speakers here this weekend. Okay, so we've got some giveaways. You guys like giveaways? So what I thought I'd do, so we've got a few Nancy Pearcey books, and I've got to actually start this with an apology. And the apology is that we don't have her books here to sell. So that's kind of a faux pas. Sorry about that. No, but here, what we do have available for you is that if you go to the Lifeway book table out there, they've got a discounted rate on her books, and there are some of her books out there. So there are some, but her latest book we actually weren't able to get from the publisher. So, but you can sign up for it and get it at a discounted rate. Now, I happen to be the owner of, I think, the most copies in the Fort Worth area. So we're going to do those as giveaways here tonight. We called every Barnes & Noble and Lifeway and everything else we could possibly think of and bought them all. Okay, and that was 4. Okay, so what we want to figure out is who has driven the furthest, traveled, maybe you flew even, traveled the furthest to be here. Who thinks they might be a contender? You need to call out, and don't say the guy's dorm, because that's not going to win. Yeah. Galveston. I might need somebody to Google some of this. GPS it, see it. Okay, Galveston. Anybody think they've traveled further than Galveston? Oklahoma City, I think there's maybe a group, right? Yeah. All right. We might have to figure out. Anybody have their GPS, Andy? I should be better at geography, I think, but we think Baton Rouge may be the furthest. Yeah? New York. State? City? Sorry? Rochester, New York. Do we have a winner? Any contenders? All right, come on up and get your copy of... So, Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. There you go. All right, well, we're going to have another giveaway. Not right now, but we will have another giveaway. And what you need to do, you got to kind of earn this one. I mean, I guess you earned it from traveling, but you got to earn this one by tweeting. Okay, so if you tweet, there it is. If you tweet something about something about the conference and hashtag it with this hashtag, We will count up. You can do it as many times as you want to, and we'll draw a winner out of that at random, and you will get a free Nancy Pearcey book. Does that make sense to you? So tweet something about this on Twitter using that hashtag. We'll search all those, gather them up, draw one randomly. So the more times you tweet, the better. You know how that works. Okay. All right. Well, we are very, very excited for this conference, and we're especially excited about our keynote speaker tonight. She's a wonderful person, just a terrific human being. Let me tell you a little bit about Nancy Pearcey. So Nancy Pearcey is professor of apologetics and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. Now, hang on, we're not done here. A fellow at the Discovery Institute, Center for Science and Culture, and editor-at-large of the Pearcey Report. She is the author of Love Thy Body, the one I just handed out, but here's another copy, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. She's also the author of the ECPA Gold Medallion winner, Total Truth. Have that one too. Liberating Christianity from Cultural Captivity. And How Now Shall We Live, co-authored with Harold Fickett and Chuck Colson. Other notable books are Finding Truth, Saving Leonardo, and a number of others. Pearcey has addressed staffers on Capitol Hill and at the White House, actors and screenwriters in Hollywood, scientists, artists, students and faculty at universities all over the country. She's published 100-plus articles in too many outlets to mention, but some notables would be Washington Post, Washington Times, Christianity Today. She's appeared on television, including Fox and Friends, NPR, and C-SPAN. So she's formally an agnostic. But she studied in Heidelberg, Germany in the early 1970s and in Switzerland at L'Abri Fellowship under none other than Francis Schaeffer. She earned a BA from Iowa State University, an MA from Covenant Theological Seminary, and pursued graduate work in history of philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. She's taught at Biola as a visiting scholar at Torrey Honors Institute, World Journalism Institute, and Cairn University, and again, currently at HBU. She's been an invited speaker all over the world, basically, all over the country. She's been hailed, this was like the leading line on her bio, hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. But I'd like to say she's one of America's preeminent evangelical Protestant intellectuals. Right? She happens to be female, but she's an important voice, and I'd encourage you to give her a warm welcome and welcome her to the stage.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I've actually been here before. I was here for a creationist conference many, many years ago, so it's good to be back. And good to see some of you again. And I wanted to start out by telling you that I changed my lecture. I was going to give you a lecture on Love Thy Body, and I still am going to give you a lecture on Love Thy Body. But I had organized it and written it for a Christian audience, emphasizing the biblical view of the body. And then I had the opportunity, just last week, in fact, to speak at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you know the Heritage Foundation, but it is the largest conservative think tank in the nation. So it's quite an honor, but it is a secular think tank. And when I got up to speak, the person introducing me emphasized, this is a secular think tank, knowing that I was going to give a lecture on moral issues. She wanted to make that very clear. And so I thought, wait a minute, maybe it would be better to give you my Heritage Foundation lecture talk, because we need to know how to frame these issues for our secular friends and in the public realm. We need to teach our students, we need to teach our children how to frame these issues in a secular environment. That's a lot tougher than framing it for your church audience, your church youth group. So I'm going to give you essentially the lecture that I gave at the Heritage Foundation, and you'll see how I brought up the issues with the Christianity a little bit more oblique. And I hope you'll find that interesting. So the book Love Thy Body covers the watershed moral issues of our day. abortion, assisted suicide, homosexuality, transgenderism, and many more. Now, typically, we try to make sense of these issues one at a time, separately, but we'll be much more effective if we realize that they all share a common worldview or a set of core convictions. And I'm going to call it secular liberalism. And I'm going to argue that it's a philosophy that undermines human dignity and human rights. And yes, I said that right in Washington, D.C. I started right out. That claim runs counter to the pervasive cultural message, of course, which is that it is conservatives, and especially religious conservatives, who want to deny civil rights to various groups. Listen to what the Supreme Court said when it struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. That's also called DOMA, which was a federal law recognizing marriages between a man and a woman. The court engaged in a bit of mind reading, accusing supporters of the law of being motivated by animus, which means hatred or hostility. Their purpose was to disparage, injure, degrade, demean, humiliate, and harm people in same-sex marriages, to brand them as unworthy, to impose a disadvantage, a stigma, to deny them equal dignity. So the court did not just say people who oppose same-sex marriage are mistaken, it denounced them as hostile and mean-spirited. So today I'm going to turn the tables. I'm going to show you that it's the liberal secular ethic that is actually harmful and demeaning. And the reason is that it's based on a low view of the body and human biology. Let me jump in right with an example to illustrate. We'll take abortion. A few years ago, an article appeared by a British broadcaster who described herself as a liberal feminist. And she said, "I had always been proudly pro-choice until she became pregnant with her own baby. And then she began to struggle." She writes, "I was calling the life inside me a baby because I wanted it. Yet if I hadn't wanted it, I would think of it as just a group of cells that it was okay to kill." To her credit, she realized that didn't make sense. A fetus doesn't become a baby just because somebody wants it. So she began to research the subject. And after several months, she reached this conclusion. She said, "In the end, I have to agree that life begins at conception. But perhaps the fact of life is not what's important. It's whether that life has grown enough to start becoming a person." So what's happened here to the concept of the human being? It's been split into two parts. Right? If you can be human and alive at one point, but not a person until some time later, then clearly these are two different things. This is a radically fragmented, fractured view of what it means to be a human being. Philosophers sometimes illustrate the dichotomy using the metaphor of two stories in a building. In the lower story is the body, our biological identity as human organisms. And today, virtually all professional bioethicists agree that life begins at conception. The evidence from genetics and DNA is too strong to deny it. But recall what the broadcaster said. Perhaps the fact of life is not so important. In other words, in the secularist view, being human, biologically, genetically, physiologically human, has no special dignity, no moral status. The body is objectified as just a disposable piece of matter, a product of the blind, material, random forces of evolution, essentially a biochemical machine. And that's why, as long as the fetus is seen as merely human, in quotes, it can be killed for any reason or no reason. It is raw material that can be used for research and experiments, tinkered with genetically, picked through for sellable parts, like Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. In other words, simply being human is not enough for human rights. Only later is a fetus recognized as a person, typically defined in terms of a higher level of cognitive functioning, autonomy, self-determination, and so on. And only then does it acquire the right to legal protection. And this is actually called personhood theory. what it means is that the arguments for abortion rest on a split or divided or dualistic view of the human being, one that sees no value in our biology, our body, except maybe a utilitarian or economic value, but locates all our moral worth in our mind or consciousness. So what's the problem with this view of personhood? Most obviously, no one can decide how to define it. If it's not equated with just being human, what is it and when does it start? Every bioethicist offers a different answer. So a few years ago, a controversial article appeared by two philosophers arguing for what they called post-birth abortion. What do they mean by that? Yes, infanticide, absolutely. And here's how they justified it. They said merely being human is not in itself a reason for ascribing to someone a right to life. And since non-persons have no moral rights to life, there are no reasons for banning after-birth abortions. So we now have a new type of individual, the human non-person. We're talking here about a momentous transformation from a mere physical thing that you can kill for any reason to a person with a dignity so profound that killing it is a crime. But there is no objective scientific evidence for any such transformation. Any cutoff point is purely arbitrary. There's a science fiction writer who illustrated this in a story that he wrote. Many of you may know him. His name is Philip Dick. Does anyone know Philip Dick? Because he wrote several stories that have been turned into famous movies like Blade Runner, Total Recall, Memento, and so on. Anyway, this story exposed him to intense controversy. It was called The Pre-Persons. And in the fictional story, the lawmakers are trying to decide when is that magical moment when a mere human is transformed into a person. And if the fetus is not a person, they decide, well, neither are newborns, so they can be killed. And then what about 3-year-olds? Peter Singer of Princeton, by the way, has argued that 3-year-olds could still be killed. And so finally, in the story, the lawmakers decide maybe the right age is 12 years old. After all, what level of cognitive functioning do you need? They said, well, maybe the ability to do algebra. I know what you're thinking. That rules out most of us. Here's how one character puts it. He says, up to that age, it was only body, animal instincts and body, animal reflexes and responses to stimuli, like Pavlov's dogs. Notice the author is really trying to help you to understand what it means when you say being merely human does not make you a person. You're like Pavlov's dogs. And as long as the child was only a body, if the parents didn't want him anymore, they could call the local abortion center, and it would send out a van to collect the child and take him in to be killed. Here are the first few lines of the story. Past the grove of cypress trees, Walter saw the white truck, and he knew it for what it was. He thought, that's the abortion truck, come to take some kid in for a postpartum abortion down at the abortion place. And then he thought, maybe my folks called it for me. He ran and hid among the blackberries, feeling the scratching of the thorns, but thinking, it's better than having the air sucked out of your lungs. That's how they do it. They have a big room for it, for the kids nobody wants. So when personhood is not rooted simply and solely in being human, it is arbitrary with no objective criteria. Every bioethicist draws the line at a different place, depending on their own private views and values. What they value most is what they decide is what defines you as a person. By contrast, if we start with biology, then we have an objective, empirically testable, universally detectable standard, something we can identify scientifically. So to be pro-science is to be pro-life. Personhood theory is also the driving force behind euthanasia. What was the most high-profile euthanasia case in recent history? Yeah, Terri Schiavo, exactly. And if you don't know Terri, she was a young woman who suffered brain damage, but her parents were happy to care for her. It was her husband who wanted her food and water discontinued, which of course would lead to her death. The media presented it as a right to die case, but Terry was not dying. She was not terminally ill, so that was not really what was at stake. The core issue came out in a television program where a bioethicist was asked, "Do you think Terry is a person?" And he said, "No, I do not. I think having awareness is an essential criterion for personhood." So according to personhood theory, if you are mentally disabled, if you no longer have a certain level of cognitive functioning, then you are no longer a person, even though you're obviously still human. At that point, you can be unplugged, your treatment withheld, your food and water discontinued, your organs harvested. Again, being human is no longer enough to qualify for human rights. You have to earn the right to legal protection by exhibiting an arbitrary level of neocortical functioning. Euthanasia is promoted in the name of compassion, but this is not compassionate. It is exclusive. It says some people don't measure up. They don't make the cut. They don't qualify for human rights. By contrast, the pro-life position is inclusive. If you're a member of the human race, you're in. Every human is a person and has the dignity and status of a full member of the moral community. Now, why does personhood theory have such a low view of just being human? Where did such a negative view of human life come from? Every ethic stems from a view of nature, and the liberal secular ethic stems from the conviction that nature is a product of mindless material forces. Historically speaking, the most important turning point was Darwin's theory of evolution. The key elements of his theory, which was random mutation and the blind automatic process of natural selection, was specifically intended to get rid of design or plan or purpose in nature. A New Yorker article recently put it this way. It said, "The loyalty oath of modernity." Isn't that a great phrase? In other words, if you want to be my modern person, this is the loyalty oath you must take. That nature is without conscious design. The emergence of Homo sapiens was without meaning or telos. You Greek students, what does telos mean? Purpose or goal, right? As a result, the human body is reduced to a collection of cells and organs and tissues no different from any other chance configuration of matter. And that explains why just being human is not thought to entail any special status or value. By the way, I'll go off script on occasion. An example is Peter Singer, the same guy who says you can kill 3-year-olds, also says, if you think humans have any special status or dignity, you are guilty of the sin of speciesism. And that's akin to racism, where you think your race is superior, or sexism, where you think your sex is superior. If you think humans are special in any way, you are committing the sin of speciesism, because the human body is no different from any other chance configuration of matter. So what worldview was Darwin seeking to displace? The worldview he was trying to get rid of is sometimes called a teleological worldview from that word telos. So it means purpose. It's evident to observation that living things are structured for a purpose. Eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, wings are made for flying, fins are made for swimming. The only reason the molecules have that particular configuration is to serve a function. And all the parts interact in a coordinated, integrated, goal-directed fashion. In fact, the whole development of an organism is directed by an inbuilt genetic plan or blueprint. So a teleological view leads to an ethic where the body has its own intrinsic purpose and dignity. Respect for the body is inseparable from respect for the person. Once you get a handle on the liberal secular ethic and this division or dichotomy or dualism between body and person, it will explain a host of other issues. Let's move now to issues of sexuality. The hookup culture rests on the assumption that sex can be purely physical, cut off from the whole person without any hint of love or commitment. Young people know the script all too well. In my new book, Love Thy Body, I include several poignant quotes from college students, like Alicia, who says, "Hookups are very scripted. You learn to turn everything off except your body, and you make yourself emotionally invulnerable." Another student named Stephanie said, "It's body first, personality comes second." Another one said, "Emotional intimacy should come before sex, but on the college campus today, it's the opposite." A college student interviewed in Rolling Stone magazine talked about the hookup culture, and she was very insightful. She said, "The mistake people make is they assume that there are two very distinct elements in a relationship, one emotional and one sexual, and they pretend like there are clean lines between them." Do you recognize the language of dualism? She's practically describing our little diagram here. It's the same fragmented, fractured view of the human being. Now, sometimes critics of the hookup culture will say it gives sex too much importance, but in reality, it gives sex too little importance. Another Rolling Stone article quoted a young man who said, sex is just a piece of body touching another piece of body. It is existentially meaningless." So the hookup mentality expresses a philosophy that your body can be treated as purely physical, driven by physical impulses and instincts. No wonder it's leaving a trail of wounded people. They're trying to live out a worldview that does not fit who they truly are. What about homosexuality? People are stunned by how quickly same-sex marriage was legalized. People on both sides, by the way. People in favor of same-sex marriage were equally surprised at how quickly they won. How did that happen? And the reason is that it's a logical implication of the same secularist ethic, with its denigration of the body. Think of it this way. Nobody really denies that on the level of biology, physiology, chromosomes, anatomy, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. So to embrace a same-sex identity, then, is implicitly to contradict that design. It's to say, why should the structure of my body inform my identity? Why should my biological sex as male or female have any voice in my moral choices? This is a profoundly disrespectful view of the body. It treats our biological identity as having no meaning, as irrelevant, as giving no clues to who we are as whole persons. Now, some people argue if sexual orientation is rooted in our genes, then they are being true to their biology. But despite extensive research, there's no conclusive evidence of any biological cause. Let's quote the American Psychological Association on this. In a pamphlet, they say, "No findings have emerged that prevent scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor." And in context, they were discussing genetic and social factors. Now, in religious circles, you will sometimes hear people say, well, God made some people homosexual. God made me the way I am. But there's a former homosexual who has a very interesting answer to that. He says, if God made some people gay, then God has played a cruel joke on them. He's engineered their minds and emotions for attraction to the same sex, yet created their physiology to be in direct opposition to that attraction. So today it's widely accepted that if someone experiences that opposition between body and mind, it's the mind that wins, and it can override your biological identity. But why accept such a demeaning view of the body? Again, the underlying logic is that the body is a product of purposeless, random forces, and therefore it has no intrinsic purpose. And the mind is free to use it any way it wants. That's exactly how one outspoken lesbian defends homosexuality. You probably know, many of you know Camille Paglia. She's a well-known lesbian feminist writer. Say yes. Some of you know her, sure. Oh, thanks. Good. I was sure at least some of you would know her. Anyway, listen to how she defends homosexuality. She acknowledges that nature has made us male and female, that humans are a sexually reproducing species. Then she asks, why not defy nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. In other words, if our bodies are merely products of undirected material forces, then they convey no moral message. They give no clue to our identity. They have no inherent purpose that we're obligated to respect. We may do with them as we see fit. Now, I'm not saying that a person involved in same-sex relations thinks this way consciously, but our actions can have logical implications that we have not thought through. Every choice we make implicitly affirms an entire metaphysic, a view of what it means to be human. In Love Thy Body, I tell several personal stories. It's been wonderful teaching at HBU because I have lots of stories from students, so that there's lots of personal application. And actually, one of my favorites is at the beginning of the chapter on homosexuality, and it's about a young man named Sean Doherty. And he was exclusively attracted to other men. And when he became a Christian in college, he decided that his only option was to be celibate. Today, though, he is married and has 3 children. So what changed? Sean said, I stopped defining my identity by my sexual feelings, and I started regarding my physical body as who I was. His goal was not to change his feelings, which rarely works. Rather, my goal was to acknowledge what I already had, a male body, as a good gift from God. And eventually, my feelings started to follow suit. So instead of defying nature, as Camille Paglia puts it, he accepted his embodied existence as fundamentally good. Now, in a teleological view, nature is not undifferentiated raw material that we may use as we see fit. The correlation between male and female is not some evolutionary accident. Nature exhibits a design, a purpose, an order, a plan. And when we live in harmony with that design, when we honor the structure of our bodies, we experience greater human flourishing. We are healthier and happier. So a teleological view gives rational grounds for our moral decisions. Morality is not an arbitrary set of rules or social conventions. When I talk to my secular friends, by the way, that's where they usually end up landing. They say, morality is just what your culture has come up with and taught you. But in a teleological view, morality is the roadmap for fulfilling our human purpose. It's the guidebook for being fully human. So Christians who hold a biblical view on homosexuality are not just relying on a few scattered Bible verses. That's a criticism I've often read, especially among gay-affirming Christians. They say, well, it's just a few scattered Bible verses here and there. No, they are making a positive case that biblical morality respects our biological identity as a gift from the hand of God. Now, if same-sex marriage happened fast, the transgender movement is happening even faster. And why is that? Because it's a logical extension of the same philosophy. In fact, the division between body and mind is even easier to recognize here because the transgender narrative itself insists that gender has nothing to do with your biological sex. A BBC documentary says, at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And when that happens, we need to help people break free of the prison of the body. There was a Fourth Circuit case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It involved a girl who identified as a boy named Gigi and demanded the right to use the boys' restroom. The judge ruled that Gigi's birth-assigned sex, or so-called biological sex, is female, but Gigi's gender identity is male. Her so-called biological sex, in sneer quotes, this is a judge writing a formal ruling in a federal court, and he treats the very existence of biological sex with suspicion. Apparently, he thinks the facts of physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, and DNA are less real than a teenager's subjective feelings. As I say, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and transgender activists were sure they were going to win, because this was under Obama. And you remember that Obama had, the Obama administration had issued guidelines to all public schools saying that they had to follow transgender guidelines. Let children be on the locker room, the restroom, the sports team, et cetera, of their choice. And so with that in place, they were poised to win. And then Donald Trump was elected, and he reversed it. So we still have states and local school districts implementing these policies. Ohio just recently implemented it for the whole state. But at least we don't currently have a federal directive. It was remanded back to the Fourth Circuit. I've been reading a book by a Princeton University professor giving a philosophical defense of transgenderism. You know, it's the high-level intellect who create the arguments that then filter down. But what was astonishing about this book is that even though she was defending transgenderism, in the process, she acknowledged that it involves disconnect, disjunction, self-division, self-estrangement. She goes on to say, the physical body tells us nothing. It has no meaning at all. So kids down to kindergarten today are being estranged from their own body. They're being taught that it tells them nothing at all about who they are. It's not part of their authentic self. But why accept such an extreme devaluation of the body? Why not instead try to recover a higher view? I recently read an interview with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years and then recovered her identity as a girl. Isn't that amazing? We're at the age now where people are actually coming out of it now, coming out of detransitioning out of a transgender life. Anyway, what she said was the turning point came when she realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body. Yeah, the article came out after my book was already in print, but I thought, what a great article for a book titled Love Thy Body. We need to communicate compassion for people who are trapped in a dehumanizing, self-alienating, self-estranging view of the human being. At the dawn of the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon said, in order to command nature, we must first obey her. What was he saying? He's saying when we intervene in nature, we must respect the givens of the natural order. We need to work with the natural order. Working against it is what has led to pollution and the destruction of the environment. We may not do as we see fit when it comes to environmental issues. And in the same way, we should respect our body by working with the givens of our biological nature. A teleological ethic offers the hope of self-integration instead of self-alienation, inner wholeness instead of inner division. And by the way, to my own surprise, I have found this to be the most effective argument when I'm talking to secular people, because so many of them are environmentalists, or at least they know they should be. And so when you argue, look, just as we need to treat nature with respect, we should treat our body with respect, that clicks, to my surprise, better than most of the other arguments that I've tried. They say, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense because I understand why we should treat the trees and the flowers, with respect. And so, my body's part of nature. I should be treating it with the same respect. Now, you don't you can't raise these issues without somebody asking, what about intersex? Doesn't that imply that sex is a spectrum? You know, there's male and female, but also a range in between. Intersex is a condition in which a person's reproductive anatomy is ambiguous or atypical due to identifiable genetic or hormonal causes. In other words, we know what causes it. We can diagnose it. But in any sexually reproducing species, there are still only two gametes. There's sperm, there's egg. There is no third gamete. And actually, I added this slide after speaking at the Heritage Foundation because I thought it's so apropos. Have any of you seen this as a TED Talk, one of the most popular TED Talks? And it's called Every Cell Has a Sex. Has anyone seen it? Oh, you should go look at it. Go watch it. It's by a cardiologist named Paula Johnson. And she says, every cell has a sex, and what that means is that men and women are different down to the cellular and molecular level. It means we're different across all of our organs, from our brains to our hearts, our lungs, and our joints. As a cardiologist, her concern is that men and women have different symptoms when they are about to have a heart attack. And women's symptoms are not the same, and unfortunately, since most of the testing is done on men, many doctors do not recognize the symptoms in women. And so when a woman shows up, they do the tests, and they don't see any symptoms, and they tell her, you're fine, go home. She goes home and has a heart attack. And so her point is that if you're going to get the best medical care, you need to know whether you're talking about whether a man and a woman is different all the way down to the cellular level. If you go online and watch this, underneath, dozens of comments saying, this is so transphobic. And then there was one very interesting response saying, all she's saying is that whatever your gender theory may be, when you get sick and the doctors put you on the operating table, they need to know your original biological sex to give you the best medical care. People with intersex, people with physical anomalies should be accepted and protected. Intersex people should not be used as political footballs by those who want to deconstruct the male-female binary. I interviewed an intersex woman for Love Thy Body, and she told me, how do you think it feels being a pawn in someone else's game? It hurts to be shoved into the LGBT camp by either side. Now, the next movement on the horizon is a completely postmodern view of sexuality. If gender is a social construction, it can be deconstructed. So what does that mean? A psychotherapist writing in a magazine that's billed for queer people explains. He says, people don't want to fit into any boxes, not gay, straight, lesbian, or bisexual ones. They want to be free to change their minds. The article was written to people who had come out of the closet as gay or lesbian and thought they had discovered their true authentic self, and then later were attracted to heterosexual relationships again. And so they were asking, who am I then? And he said, not to worry. We're moving away from the old modernist way of thinking that you're born with a gender rooted in your biology. And we're moving to a postmodern view that gender is something we can choose and therefore something we can change. And in fact, research shows that about 80% of people who come out as homosexual change their sexual identity label at least once, to heterosexual, bisexual, queer, or unlabeled. In public schools, this cartoon, the gender unicorn, who's seen this before? Surely. It's ubiquitous. Most places, everyone in the room raises their hands. You guys need to get out in the public school system more. Find out what our kids are being exposed to. This is ubiquitous in the public schools these days. My sister is a psychotherapist, and they were using it to teach them, to teach therapists, supposedly under the rubric of teaching you how to handle sexual assault. This has nothing to do with sexual assault. They'll use any rubric to teach postmodern sexual theory. Anyway, it is used to deconstruct sexuality into 5 separate factors: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, and emotional or romantic attraction. They can all be different. The cartoon is teaching students that there's no unified self, that you are a disconnected, discordant patchwork of bits and pieces that can all be contradictory. Even feminists are protesting this drastic fragmentation. A feminist philosopher warns that we are perpetuating the deep modern alienation of our human being from nature. Another says we should protest this disavowal of biology. To clarify our identity, we should turn toward the body, not away from it. And of course, why are feminists concerned? They're concerned because to protect women's rights, you must be able to say what a woman is. Of course, people, by the way, you guys will appreciate this. I cut a lot that I usually give it for a Christian audience, but this is one that a Christian audience will appreciate. There was a book by a woman named Virginia Mollenkott, and she was one of the early evangelical feminists in the 1970s. Did anyone remember her from the Virginia Mollenkott? I thought you might. Well, I don't know what she calls herself now. She's gone far beyond feminism, and she wrote a book called Omnigender, in which she argues that all genders are now up for grabs. And there was a review written in a theological journal, and the review said, in all seriousness, debates about women's ordination will have to be rethought because we do not know anymore what a woman is. And I thought, how sad that we live in an era when people no longer know what a man or a woman is. That they've so imbibed the Darwinian sense that your identity is just a biological accident. It tells you nothing about who you are. Your identity as male or female has no special dignity in itself, and they do not know what a man or a woman is. Of course, people are much more than biological organisms, and biology is not even the most important part of life. But since the body is what's being disparaged, that's where we must focus our defense. Our feelings can change, and they often do, but our biological sex is an unchanging, empirically knowable fact about ourselves, and that's why it makes sense to let biology inform our gender identity. Now, in all of these issues, people will often respond, come on, how do other people's choices affect you? Why not just let them live the way they want to? And the answer is that when laws are changed, they affect everyone. A free society is possible only if it recognizes some rights as pre-political. That means they're prior to the state. The state doesn't create them, it merely recognizes them. And many pre-political rights are based on biology. So as we dismiss biology, we are losing those rights. The right to life is a pre-political right. It's something you have just because you're a member of the human race. But the only way the state could legalize abortion was to rule that some humans are not persons, legal persons, right? So that means the state has claimed the authority to decide which humans have the most fundamental right of all, the right to live, the right not to be killed. Based not on biology, based not on being biologically human, but just on its own legal fiat. This is a huge power grab by the state. An enormous increase in state power. We've had legalized abortion since 1973, and I think a lot of people still haven't quite realized what this means. It means that you have no rights just because you're a human being. You have only the rights the state gives you. Marriage is a pre-political right based on the fact of sexual reproduction. But the only way the state could treat same-sex couples the same as opposite-sex couples was to decide that biology is irrelevant and redefine marriage as a purely emotional commitment, which is what the Supreme Court did in its Obergefell decision. Trouble is, we have lots of emotional connections, So the state has claimed the authority to define which relationships qualify as marriage, based not on biology, but only on its own say-so. Totally arbitrary. Until recently, most people thought your gender followed metaphysically on your biological sex, that there was a natural connection. But the only way the state can treat a trans woman, that is somebody born male, the same as a biological woman, is to dismiss biology as irrelevant. And that's why public schools are enforcing policies telling teachers what pronouns they must use, who they must call he or she, regardless of the student's biological sex. And I've been reading same-sex advocates, especially lawyers. They say that the next step will be parenthood. Until now, who counts as a child's legal parents was based on biological relationship. It's called the presumption of parenthood. If you're biologically related to the child, you're the parent. But in a same-sex couple, at least one parent is not biologically related to any child that they have. And so the only way the state can treat same-sex parents the same as opposite-sex parents is to redefine parenthood without regard to biology. They will define it in some terms of something arbitrary, like what level of emotional commitment you have to this child, just like with marriage. But then you will be your child's parent only by permission of the state. And what the state gives, the state can take away. Human rights are no longer unalienable. These issues are sold to the public as a way of expanding choice, but in reality, they hand over power to the state. Now, wait a minute, people will often say to me, the low view of the body in Western culture is not a product of secularism, it's a product of Christianity. After all, there are reasons we have terms like puritanical. And there's some truth to that. I have a grad student who said, I was always raised thinking, spirit good, body bad. And that's how she summed it up. Like, we have this kind of sacred secular dualism, right? Where we think, we tend to give the impression that spiritual things are what's important, and that this world, this physical world, is not so important. So there's some truth to that, but the reason is that many Christians are out of touch with their own heritage. The early Christian church faced a very similar challenge. This is so fascinating. They faced a culture also that devalued the material world, just like modern secularism does, although for different reasons. The early church faced a culture dominated by philosophies like Platonism and Gnosticism that treated this world as a realm of death, decay, and destruction. In fact, Gnosticism actually taught that there were several levels of spiritual beings, and that this world was created by the lowest level God, an evil God, because no self-respecting God would get his hands dirty mucking about with matter. Gnosticism denigrated the body as the prison house of the soul, and the goal of salvation was to escape from the physical realm, to leave it behind. In this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary. It taught that the material universe was created by not a low-level deity, but by the supreme God, the ultimate, the highest God, and therefore it is intrinsically good. Christianity's greatest scandal, though, at the time, was the concept of the incarnation, the claim that the supreme deity had entered into the realm of matter and taken on a physical body. The incarnation is the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. What's more, when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, we might say he did escape the physical realm, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical, bodily resurrection. To the Greeks, this was not spiritual progress, this was regress. Who would want to come back to the body? The whole idea was utter foolishness to the Greeks. And what will happen at the end of time? Historic Christianity says God is not going to scrap the material universe as though he made a mistake the first time. He's going to restore it and renew it, creating a new heavens and a new earth. The Apostles' Creed from the beginning has affirmed the resurrection of the body. This is an astonishingly high view of the physical realm. There's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. No wonder the American founders deemed it self-evident that unalienable rights are possible only if they are endowed by the Creator, as the Declaration of Independence puts it. And the fascinating thing is that many secular thinkers agree. The ultra-atheist Friedrich Nietzsche said the concept of the equality of souls before God furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. A British philosopher, John Gray, who's an atheist, contemporary philosopher, says Darwin has shown us that we are animals. Any atheist claim that humans have special dignity is only a secular version of Christian faith. It's a derivative of Christianity. Philosopher Richard Rorty, also an atheist, says, I don't know. On secular grounds, I don't know how to justify or defend social democracy in a philosophical way. In fact, the idea of universal rights originated from religious claims that human beings are made in the image of God. And then he writes, this Jewish and Christian element in our tradition is gratefully invoked by freeloading atheists like myself. So what's he saying? He's saying he has to reach over and borrow the concept of universal rights from our Judeo-Christian heritage, and he calls himself a freeloading atheist. So even atheist thinkers acknowledge they have to freeload from Christianity to have a basis for human rights. Politics is downstream from culture. Have you ever heard that phrase? I used to live on Capitol Hill, and all my friends who work in the national, the federal government, who are Christian, that's one of their favorite phrases. Politics is downstream from culture, because it's easy when you work in Washington to start thinking you've got your hand on the levers of power, right? So they remind themselves that no, you can't really change a culture from the top down. You can only pass laws that the culture is already prepared to accept. Politics is downstream from culture. To be effective politically, we cannot avoid these larger philosophical, scientific, and even theological questions. What does it mean to be human? Just being human should be enough to guarantee human rights. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you. So we've got a few minutes here for Q&A. So if you have any questions that you'd like to pose or to ask, yeah.
Hi, Nancy. My name is Brandon Tedjdor. I'm a graduate of the Christian Apologetics program here, also a supporter of the Bible and Beer Consortium, so thank you for coming and speaking with us last year.
Could you speak a little more slowly because there's a bit of an echo?
Oh, sorry about that.
I caught most of it, though.
All right, so my question is basically about what's essential to our bodily identity. So my thought process, we have these advances in technology that are making it easier to replace limbs, replace organs, things like that. So far, it seems like it may be that only the brain, which is linked to our consciousness, may be essential as far as what we need to continue living in this body. And then we also have in theology, we have our state of being between death prior to the resurrection, as well as the fact that after the resurrection, we will exist in some sort of new bodily state, which may even have some changed DNA to eliminate genetic disorders and anything that causes us to deteriorate or die over time. So with all of these issues, just what is it that is essential to our identity with our body to avoid kind of I guess it's a ship of Theseus dilemma. Like, how many parts can you replace before you have a completely different ship?
Yeah, I have had a few people misunderstand this and think I was saying that your identity is primarily in your body. That's why I made a point of saying we're more than physical organisms, and the body isn't even the most important dimension. Right? It's just that the body is what's under attack right now, and Christianity has a high view of the dignity and value of the human body, and we should be leading with that. I mean, this gives us a positive argument that we can use with people. We are so known for having negative approaches, right? It's wrong, it's a sin, don't do it, all the thou shalt nots. But if we can come across saying, look, we have a high view of the dignity and status of the human body, and we want to help you, talking to a secular person, we want to help you recognize the beauty and dignity of your own body. This gives us a positive. We are promoting a Christian ethic, not out of a negative view that this body doesn't matter, that this life doesn't matter, but because we have a high view of the body as a creation of God. What God creates has value, period. So if God has created the body, it has value. And so if we lead with that, we can help draw people in with the beauty of the Christian ethic. We can show that it is more appealing, more attractive than the secular ethic. We can help them see the secular ethic has this fractured, fragmented view of the human person that's actually very dehumanizing, very demeaning, and that by contrast, the Christian view is very positive. So that's my main goal. Now, when you get down to details, I'm still a dualist in the sense I believe there's body and soul. I do think there's a soul. And so I had a friend who was gay affirming, and so he was very eager to be critical since he didn't agree with me. So he kept accusing me of overstating the value of the body and maybe being a Christian physicalist. There's going to be a talk on that later tonight. Christian physicalism. No, I'm not a physicalist. I do believe that there's a soul, and like you said, there's something that survives death. But all I'm arguing is that in our cultural moment right now, the positive message we have is the beauty and value of the body. See, where secularists are going, I have a section in Love Thy Body on transhumanism. They're going to many of them are starting to argue that the body has so little value because, after all, it's just one step in the vast evolutionary chain of beings, one minor step, in the staircase of evolution. And why not use genetic engineering to engineer some higher stage? What we are now, why value that? And some of them, as you probably know, some of them are even starting to argue that we can create a kind of digital immortality by downloading the mind onto a computer disk, and then we don't need bodies at all. One of the key spokesmen for that view is a transgender woman, right? So she's born male, who identifies as a woman, named Martine Rothblatt, and she has written on promoting the idea that we should download our minds digitally. And she says, what, you think a flesh and blood body is better? In that case, you're guilty of fleshism. So now we have speciesism earlier. This is fleshism. For you to think there's any value in the flesh and blood body means you are guilty of fleshism. So that's where the secular view is going, to the point of completely denigrating the value and dignity of the body. So this opens up a wonderful opportunity to us to craft a positive message and to help people see that it's affirming, it's life affirming, it's dignity affirming. It actually gives them, like we were talking about earlier, it's the beauty of the Christian worldview that will draw people in.
Hi there. I'm curious as to how you would respond to those who would say that the Christian denial of things like same-sex marriage and LGBT plus rights is just an expression of religious-based bigotry.
Yeah, well, what was fascinating to me when I was researching Love Thy Body is the Christian church has often faced cultures where same-sex relations were common. In ancient Greece and Rome, when the Christian church was born, it was born into a culture where there were virtually no moral limits on sexuality, especially for men. It was perfectly acceptable for men to have sex with prostitutes and mistresses and girlfriends and especially slaves. It was just understood that your slave was at your disposal. Most infidelity consisted of sex with your slaves. And by the way, both men and women, both boys, both adults and children. And some of that was Pearcey, that is younger men, adolescents, but some of it was children. And in fact, it was actually a common topic of debate. If you have a debate club, there's certain topics that are very common. A common topic of debate was, is sex with men better or is sex with women better? And Aristophanes argues, sex with men is much better. Why is that? Well, because everyone knows that men are superior. And your character is evaluated by what you love. So if you love men, that shows that you are a superior person. You are more manly. You are more noble. So in a culture where same-sex relations were not only accepted, but actually exalted as better by many people, they still reserved marriage for male and female. Why? They still understood you needed legal protection for the one relationship that gives rise to children. So it doesn't take a Christian to think this way. This is normal. This is a normal human insight that even a culture, obviously they were not restricting marriage to male and female out of bigotry or hatred or discrimination, because many of them thought sex with men was fine. One of the worst examples that I give in my book was a Roman poet writing in the 1st century was chastising wives for being upset that their husbands were having sex with their male slaves, with boys, slave boys. And he says, everyone knows sex with boys is more pleasurable, so get over it. So that's how common it was. And still, they reserved legal marriage for male and female. So that's not an imposition of a Christian view. Many cultures have recognized the need to give legal protection to male-female marriage.
We'll have to move to our breakout sessions. Can you guys thank Nancy Pearcey one more time? Thank you so much. Such a relevant message. Just a couple things to let you know about. If you stop by the Swibbits table, the Southwestern table just out there, there's a free book for you, Everyday Apologetics, written by me, but you should still take it. Just take one. Just get a free book there. And if you want to, while you're there, and if you fill out one of these cards, the cards that just gives you your information, all that sort of stuff, we'll be doing a few giveaways from that too. We'll be drawing those later in the conference. And so grab one of those cards and get those filled out, and then we will do a drawing for those. Okay, we're going to move into our breakout sessions.